Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Leon Hartwell. Welcome to another LSE Ideas Russia-Ukraine dialogue. Since its inception in March 2022, we have emphasized the profound impacts of this conflict, not only on Ukraine and Russia, but also on the global stage. Today, our focus will be on the relationship between this war and Russia's future. Russia's economy remains fragile, producing only about 3% of the world's GDP, lagging far behind major players like the US and China. Even if the Russia-Ukraine war were to end today, its repercussions on Russia's economy are likely to last for decades to come, especially given the country's heavy dependence on energy and Western responses to the conflict. At the same time, the disparities within Russia are evident. About 22% of Russians, by official account, live in the poverty zone, barely able to afford basic food and staples. Nearly 14% of Russia's population struggles to survive on an income of approximately 128 euros per month. On the other end of the spectrum, 500 super wealthy Russians control more wealth than the poorest 99.8% of the population. Russia also finds itself amid significant demographic changes with a declining population and a diminishing percentage of ethnic Russians. Notably, Russia's Muslim population is projected to constitute nearly 1/3 of Russia's total population by 2050. As we delve into the complexities of Russia's domestic landscape, we cannot overlook the role of President Vladimir Putin, who is first and foremost responsible for the Russia-Ukraine war. Despite the devastating consequences of the war, Putin's popularity remains remarkably high. According to a poll by Levada in March of this year, Putin's popularity was still above 80%, despite the high cost of this war. According to estimates from Western intelligence and military officials, Russia has recorded more than 100,000 dead and wounded in Ukraine since February 2022. Recently, two independent Russian media outlets, Mediazona and Meduza, conducted a statistical analysis suggesting that nearly 50,000 Russian men have died in the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu's expansion of Russia's military is in progress and will see the force grow by about 30%, reaching approximately 1.5 million men. Now, today, we will attempt to answer the following two questions. How is the war impacting on Russia's domestic situation? And how is Russia's domestic landscape impacting the war? We're honored to have a panel of very distinguished guests who will share their insights and perspectives on these critical matters. But before we proceed, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Yelena Cook, who will serve as our official translator during this dialogue, enabling us to bridge the language barrier and fostering better understanding. For our Zoom audience, you have the option to select either English or Russian for this dialogue. Please go to the bottom of your screen and choose the language you prefer, as that will be the one you hear through your speakers. Now, once again, thank you, Yelena, for your invaluable contribution today. Now, with further ado, I am delighted to introduce three distinguished panelists whose expertise will shed light on the future of Russia in the wake of this momentous conflict. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Mikhail Khodorkovsky, founder of the Russian Anti-War Committee. He was also once the richest man in Russia, and in 2003, not long after calling out Putin's regime in a televised debate about corruption, he was charged with fraud and spent over a decade behind bars in Russia. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Janusz Bugajski, senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. He most recently authored a new book, Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Natalia Arno, the president of the Free Russia Foundation. I'd like to also commend her for her support of Russian activists and for building bridges with Ukrainians. Welcome to all three of you. I am first going to turn to Mikhail. Welcome again to this Russia-Ukraine dialogue. I'm very delighted to have you part of this conversation. Now, I recently heard you talk in Vilnius at the Russia Forum about the intimate connection between the Russia-Ukraine war and the domestic situation in Russia. Now, should Russia win or lose the war, what will be the impact on Russia in each of those two scenarios? Thank you, Mikhail.
Good afternoon, everyone. Unfortunately, there is no unambiguous direct link. We might not see it, but if Russia loses this war, the Putin regime will grow weaker. And this would create opportunities for the regime change. Whether people take this opportunity into their hands or not, this will depend on us. To win this war, Putin is not capable of doing that. This scenario has already been discussed many times. Even if we suppose the impossible, the Putin troops capturing the entire Ukraine, occupying the entire Ukraine, or the biggest part of Ukraine. We know from the experience of the end of the Second World War that the partisan movement in Ukraine continued for many years after the end of that war. Therefore, it would not create an easy background for Putin in any case, in the case of defeat or victory.
Thank you, Mikhail, for reminding us of that intimate connection also. And we definitely will have some follow-up questions on your opening statements there. Janusz, if I can turn to you, please unmute your mic for me. In your most recent book you wrote, while pursuing its imperial project, Russia's domestic failures have become starker and the decentralized federation confronts decay, turmoil, and fracture, unquote. Can you elaborate for us on that statement, and what would you say the Wagner mutiny, would you say that the Wagner mutiny was a symptom of these issues? Thank you, Janusz.
Yeah, thanks, Leon. Can you hear me? Because the internet's a bit unstable. I just lost the end of Mikhail's opening comments. I don't want to talk too fast because Yelena said not to talk too fast. So I'll try and stick to answering your question. And Leon, thank you for asking me to speak at my old alma mater from the 1970s. I mean, a lot of water has flowed under London Bridge, I would say, since that time, but it's good to be back. And hello, Natalia and Mikhail, good to be in conference with you. In answer to your question, Leon, I do posit in my book that Russia faces, without political pluralism, without systemic economic reform, and I would say also without extensive regional autonomy, I think Russia's federal structure will become increasingly unmanageable. As the war, we've already heard about that, but the war and the sanctions continue to bite at the foundations of the state. But I would say this, so even if reforms taken by weak state, and I was trying to preserve the country, I think several regions, and particularly several republics,
Janusz,
yes?
your connection is failing, unfortunately. I wonder if you could maybe log in through your phone in the meantime, and then I'll go to Natalia and come back to your question.
I've tried that. It doesn't work. That doesn't work.
Okay, it seems okay now. Let's try one more time.
Yeah, okay. Do you want me to continue?
Yeah. No, we can't hear you, Janusz. I think let's go to Natalia in the meantime. while we wait for Janusz to get back his connection. Natalia, welcome again.
Thank
Natalia,
you.
can you please walk us through the widening disparities between Moscow and the federal regions? And this is, I think, a crucial question that as Westerners and outsiders, we don't always understand these disparities. Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. I first of all wanted to commend you on this series. It's very strategically visionary and in the long term a very important thing to have such discussions, Russia-Ukraine dialogue. It's a very painful subject, of course, right now, but it's very important to continue that and especially prove it with concrete work of doing everything to support Ukraine. So I hope like our conversation today will contribute to this. But also it's important to say that what is happening is an absolutely terrible, the most terrible tragedy, the worst possible scenario. And of course, we believe in Ukraine's victory. We just need it to happen faster. And I think it all connected to what is going to happen in Russia after that, because I think a lot of Western leaders are hesitant about supporting Ukraine more, not believing in the prospects of democracy in Russia. And I think only democracy in Russia is a guarantee of sustainability of Ukraine's victory and one of the key factors of security and stability in the region and globally. It's very, very important that we get there, and I understand skeptics of such prospects, but again, we as pro-democracy Russians just cannot afford not to believe in it. We have to strive for it every second of our existence. Of course, Russia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. You just named about how many people control it. Like again, I would say less than 10% would control like 90% of Russian wealth. Of course, Moscow has always been such a strong center with like a dozen of regions that are donors to the Russian budget, and all the rest are recipients of dotations. And the Moscow is the one power that redistributes all this, and of course it controls all the regions a lot. Russia is not only the country of 11 time zones or 80 plus regions. I don't want even to count occupied territories. There are a lot of occupied territories now. But there's also a country of over 190 ethnic minorities. Of course, you also mentioned all these people who live under poverty. And actually what is happening right now with this war, it's basically the tax on poverty, because the Kremlin is using these people from the poorest regions of Russia as cannon fodder for this war in Ukraine. The disparity is huge, it's growing. I remember numbers, I think it was an independent Russian analytical resource, Riddle, saying that, for example, Dagestan, which one of the, again, the biggest on receiving dotations from the Kremlin, like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the difference between this region and Moscow, and Dagestan is also one of the most multi-ethnical region, multi-linguistical region of Russia. It was like something about 27 times difference. Now it's like 400. Of course, under Putin's regime, it's all of this expediting. Another thing to understand is that Russian Federation actually is such a myth. Federation is such a Potemkin village. We have never had a real federalism, and this is what is very important to fight for, like a real federalism. Russia doesn't have many other things as well: no rule of law, no democratic institutions, no free and fair elections, no human rights observance, everything else, but no real federation as well. And it's in all these discussions, it's very, very important when we have more like self-identity of many regional, of many ethnicities, of many regions, and so on, not to confuse it with more demand for federalism instead of dissolution of Russia or anything else. It's very important to understand. I think this is one of the fears, again, that everybody inside Russia have, and Putin was able to rally everybody around this, that the West wants only to destroy Russia, and many Western leaders are hesitant about helping Ukraine more, about thinking about prospects of this dissolution. So it's very important to note. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. That's great food for thought, and I think some of it also touches on some of the issues that Janusz started to talk about. Also, Janusz, if you can hear me, please unmute. I think your main point was, without some form of major changes in Russia, especially with regards to devolution, that Russia faces some serious questions back home. Would you care to just continue where you pick up where you left off?
Yeah, hopefully I'm not interrupted again by internet. The point I was trying to make is that with reform, with federalization, there is a chance that most of Russia could survive, although I think some federal units may still choose to leave if they're allowed to. However, I cannot see that on the horizon. I cannot see a process of democratization, decentralization, devolution. So what I'm arguing is without that, as the state gets weaker because of the war, because of the sanctions, because of the incompetent leadership, because of the power struggles that we're beginning to witness, all those factors, I think, will feed into a rupture scenario, which is what I talk about in my book. I know you want to come back to this a bit later. And I think one symptom of this, and you asked me in the very beginning the question about the Wagner, the discordant Wagner symphony, as I would call it, this mutiny against the defense ministry. I think it's part of an escalating struggle. We're only seeing the surface here, an escalating struggle, not between Democrats and authoritarians, but between security actors to try and prevent military defeat, to try and preserve the state, and to control its resources. And I think it's symptomatic of much deeper cleavages amongst the power elite, amongst the Siloviki, amongst the security forces. Let me make three last points there before you go on very brief points about the mutiny. One, I think it exposed divisions within Russia's military and security structures and the fear of revolution and state collapse. I mean, Putin himself was talking about this and has talked about this in the past. Secondly, I think it did reveal Putin's vulnerabilities, his weaknesses when faced with an armed opponent who could basically approach the gates of Moscow virtually unopposed. It demonstrates that the Kremlin ultimately cannot trust the military establishment or parts of the military establishment or some of the security organs, either to win the war or to maintain the integrity of the state. Last point, I think we've had this illusion that Russia is a very strong state, partly because of propaganda, disinformation, the old Soviet myths, when that didn't last either, did it? What we saw during this mutiny is that the security forces cannot control all of Russia. I mean, Rostov fell to a few thousand troops in a matter of hours, much quicker than Kiev ever fell to Russian troops. Anti-regime insurgents, I mean, they operate with impunity across Ukraine's borders into Belgorod, Bryansk, and other oblasts. And I think Prigozhin's insurrection is going to provide a boost to other potential revolutionaries and insurrectionists in Russia. And they're not all necessarily going to be, like Prigozhin claims, pro-Putin. Some of them are going to be very anti-Kremlin. Some will be pro-independence Chechens or other ethnic units, other ethnic groups. And I would say an assortment of other grievances that will be exposed as a result of the weakness and increasing rupture of the state. And that's really what my book is about. Let me stop there, Leon.
Thank you, Janusz. I think that's some good food for thought also, and your point is also taken that the mutiny happened as a result to try and preserve the existing system, not to change it, which is a really interesting perspective. I would like to encourage our panelists also, if you have any points of disagreement, feel free to just make a point or two on that if you disagree with any of the other panelists. But I'm going to circle back to Mikhail, and I'm going to ask you a question now. You have, in the past, you stated that Russia's integration is impending, especially with regards to intensifying conflicts in the North Caucasus, Middle Volga, and Sakha. If I understand correctly, you also implied that Russia can either be democratic or united, but not both. Does that entail that some republics will inevitably secede? How do you see that? Thank you, Mikhail.
I would like to first and foremost to make it more precise, to have the understanding that the juxtaposition as united, we're talking about the opposite is not the collapse, but federalization. So we either have, Russia could only be a unitary state or a democratic state, but it also can be a federation, a proper federation, and a proper democracy at the same time. It can be both. Why? Russian regions differ from each other in a big way, both in terms of their nature and landscape, and in terms of their social and political development and their economic development. And all the major perception of the people living in different regions are different. Unifying or trying to reduce them to some unified structure can only be done by authoritarian rule. If we want to have a democratic rule, in that case, we need to provide the regions with the possibility to be themselves. Unfortunately, to my greatest regret for all of us, to be themselves for the regions, for the majority of Russian regions, it doesn't mean to be democratic. In Russia, there are regions that could well be counted as European post-industrial societies. We're talking about the capitals and some big cities. We're talking about a dozen big cities in Russia. There are other regions that have been industrialized, not post-industrial, industrialized regions. And they're much less democratic in terms of their social, mental makeup. And there are other regions which are still stuck at the pre-industrial stage, where the tribal clan relations are much stronger. To introduce democracy in those regions along the European lines would be only possible in dozens of years, step by step, trying to prove to people the advantages of such democracies, or by force. So if we're introducing democracy by force, we are talking about authoritarian rule. Therefore, either we have united or democratic. When we're talking about the separation or secession of certain regions, we have to understand that Russia is a country that has been squeezed from different directions by not necessarily most well-wishing and benevolent countries. We know the territorial ambitions of China. We know about the difficulties that Russia faces vis-a-vis the South, countries neighboring it on the South border. So the regions are well aware of the fact that remaining independent within the present context, which is quite a complex context, would be very difficult for them. Secondly, Russia has the infrastructure which is really focused on the center. All the roads, all the main roads go through the center of Russia. In order to break it up, to change it, to remake it, one would have to make a lot of effort, invest a lot of money, and spend years and years to do that, and so on and so forth. From this point, secession of any region from Russia would lead to considerable decrease of people's standards of living in those regions. in the regions that secede from Russia. There is no doubt about it. Whether certain regions would be ready, and those people who live in those regions are going to be ready to do that, despite all the negative scenarios, well, there is a paradox here we are facing. There is logic when authoritarian regime is in place, but in the conditions of an authoritarian regime, it's very difficult to secede. But when you have a normal federation and normal democratic rule, there is less logic to separate, to secede. Nevertheless, it is possible, as people say, that Russia might start breaking up on its edges, along its edges. So there is quite a high probability, or there is probability that certain republics in the North Caucasus are going to secede. If this happens as a result of an honest referendum, a fair referendum with an informed population, with observing rights of minorities, I don't see anything untoward in that. Why not, after all?
Thank you very much, Mikhail. I think a lot of these issues are not very well known from the Western perspective, and I think especially given how the media space is sort of shrinking in Russia, we have less information about what's going on in Russia, and we normally think about Russia as a very kind of unified structure. But I think your comments, Natalia's comments, Janusz and his comments, especially his book, also highlights the complexities of the situation back in Russia. I'm going to turn again to Janusz. Janusz, if you could unmute for us, please. In your book, you have outlined a multitude of rupture scenarios for Russia. Can you tell us about the most likely ones and the implications thereof, especially with regards to risks? Thank you, Janusz.
Thanks, Leon. Yeah, as you said, it's not going to be a simple process. In fact, I talk about two chapters actually I devote to how I envisage both the drivers of the rupture and the scenarios of the rupture. And I think it's going to be a mix of the Soviet and Yugoslav scenarios from the 1990s. It's not going to be a single event. We're not going to wake up tomorrow and we have 5 new Russias, or 1 Russia and 4 new states, or 20 new states, whatever it is. It's going to be a number of rolling crises, breakdowns, political, economic, security breakdowns, local revolts. A lot's going to be focused on the regional governors, as there was with party secretaries in the old Union republics. Are they going to turn towards nationalism and separation, or are they going to try and remain loyal to Moscow? And then who in Moscow will they remain loyal to as the power struggles continue? And as you know, Leon, you're in Belgrade. Even the collapse of Yugoslavia was not uniform. I mean, it was violent in some places like Bosnia and Croatia and in Kosovo, but certainly Montenegro, Serbia, Slovenia got out scot-free. And also the Soviet Union, where there were attempts by the security forces to try and preserve the country. We saw this with the attacks in Vilnius, in Yerevan, in Tbilisi and other places, to try and frighten people away from the prospect of separation. It didn't work. But I think it's going to be a mix. I mean, in some places, I think it could be relatively peaceful. As Mikhail said, in some, even if there is a sort of genuine federation that's established, which I tend to doubt is going to happen, even then some republics may secede, and that may happen peacefully. But in other cases, I think it could be violent, and particularly where Moscow would want to preserve those republics and regions that have resources, whether in Western Siberia, in the Urals, or Middle Volga or elsewhere. Also, another thing I talk about in my book is the possibility of conflicts both within, but also between the new emerging entities of Russia, of post-Russia. In other words, as we know, there are a lot of border disputes even in the North Caucasus. between Chechnya and Dagestan and Ingushetia and South Ossetia. There are some potential confederal arrangements that we could witness, you know, the Idel-Ural question, of course, in the Middle Volga region, the North Caucasus, the old mountain republic could be revived. So you could have all sorts of new combinations, new permutations as the crisis unfolds. And it could take a long time. One could even say that the whole Yugoslav crisis is not over, it's still continuing. So I don't envisage, again, I go into a lot of detail and a lot depends, of course, on how strong Moscow is, what it focuses on, whether it turns to ethno-nationalism, which it hasn't completely as yet. As you know, Milosevic turned to Serbian nationalism, which really was the end of the state, because then all the other nationalisms rose to the forefront. If the Kremlin does go for Ruski nationalism, then I think we're going to, particularly Orthodox Pravoslavny Ruski nationalism, you're going to have even more conflicts, I think, than I've outlined, both by the majority ethnic Russian population, but also the large minorities or even majorities in some parts of the country against the ethnic Russian population. Islamophobia, anti-refugee, you know, all these elements I think could create a potential for civil wars, rebellions, revolts, revolutions in some parts of the country. So it's a mixed bag. Read the book.
Thank you, Janusz. And of course, I know you spend a lot of time also doing research on the Balkans specifically. So, you know, what was interesting for me, from my eyes also as someone who closely observes the Balkans, is that I just thought that given the size of Russia and the complexity of Russia, that if Russia disintegrates in such a scenario, that it will make the Balkan wars seem quite timid by comparison. It's certainly very scary to even conceive something like that. But of course, you argue that these are scenarios. It's not something that will necessarily happen, but it's important to think about these scenarios. Natalia, while we focus on this issue of Russian identity, and Janusz pointing out that there is this risk of Ruski nationalism, for example, you know, sort of taking center stage in Russia. Let's talk a little bit more about identity. In a 2020 Levada Center poll, the majority of the respondents said that they wanted to organize the country in accordance with, quote unquote, Russia for Russians. Can you talk to us about ethnic Russian xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and nationalism, perhaps? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to briefly answer this question, but also respond to some of the speakers. Of course, Russia being a very undemocratic country, it has all the problems of such a regime. It has corruption, it has not only issues of racism, xenophobia, and nationalism, but also chauvinism and sexism and homophobia and bigotry, all kinds of intolerance and everything else. It's very, very understandable. It's quite a sick society, zombified by 24/7 propaganda, Kremlin's propaganda for so many years. And one of the biggest battlefields for us, pro-democracy Russians, would be for the values of the Russian society. So it's very important to understand that. About Levada poll, it also, we can compare it with a Pew Research poll that was conducted just a year before, and we can see that again, 76% of Russians were had some favorable views on Muslims, and 75% of Russians favorable views on Jews. And even in this Levada poll itself, 29% of Russians determined this slogan "Russian for Russians" as fascist, and 20 said they don't they are quite neutral to this, and only 19 said yes, they completely support this this slogan. And yes, it was a very high number of a negative attitude to some ethnicities. For Roma population, for example, I think 52%. But again, everything was on the Muslims, on Roma, on immigration in general, which is a huge immigration policies are huge headaches for many countries. It was even some better results if to compare with few research as well as in EU member countries. So as for just what to say about what the previous speaker said, I completely agree with Mikhail Khodorkovsky saying that a unitary form of regime and federalization, they are completely impossible. It's impossible to build federation inside unitary state. And federalism and democracy, of course, federalism can improve and strengthen the democracy, but it can also its sequence of how it will happen. Again, we should get democratization first, and then it's possible to make the next step, federalization. And it's a very complicated process, and it's a again, we can study right now. It's a good time for us. Like we should use it as our homework to prepare all these reforms and how to get and good examples of symmetrical and asymmetrical federalist countries, and probably, I don't know, Canadian experience may be more relevant, or German experience, and so on. And in all this, again, it's not only strong regions, it's also strong center. It's all like everything is fair. Everything is like it's a fair bargaining between regions and between federal unities and things like that. Like I remember the words of a member of European Parliament from Lithuania, Andrius Kubilius, who was saying that in the 80s, at first, even they being in the occupied countries, at first they were well, it was first impossible to protest at all, because again, the Soviet Union was very strong. As soon as it became like weaker and it was possible to get out and express what they believed in, at first it was rallies for the right to protest, for the right to speak out. So it was like, again, to have more democracy, and then more like, again, some other rights and visions for this or that region. So I don't think that I don't believe that much in a rupture of Russia. It's very difficult. I think it's a much further scenario, but much more. Again, it's possible. Self-determination is a very important right. It's very possible. But again, it's possible to do it in a fair way only when there is democracy. As for regions, again, it's not right to compare it with the Soviet Union. Russia now is a more homogeneous society than the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, there were, again, all these 15 republics where the titular ethnicities, they were in majority on all 15 republics. And Russians in this entire Soviet Union, they were not majority, they were half of the population. Right now, Russians comprise 81% of Russians. And even if all national republics completely like break away, it's still like, I don't know, 78% of the territory. It's still not ruptured, maybe break away, but not like some splits, but also in the republics, I don't see the demand. Well, first of all, yes, it can be explained by big propaganda, but also by Stalin policies, because all the, like, again, even how they will break away, how the split will come, like all this was such an arbitrary division by Soviet bureaucrats, very often by the number of members of the Communist Party in this or that district. I don't know, in Kharkov there were 28 districts. In the west of Ukraine there were much less. Or like the current Republic of Buryatia by Stalin, it was in 5 different regions, now in 3 different regions. Nowhere Buryats are in a majority. Even in the Republic of Buryatia itself, it's less than 30%. We have very few regions with a majority of titular, like indigenous people, nations as a majority. We see more. It's very important not to confuse these demands for self-determination, for cultural diversity, for respect, for more less racism and xenophobia with these separatism movements. Maybe they are in the diaspora right now, but again on the ground. But how can we see the proofs that it resonates among populations? For example, when the Democratic pro-democracy and anti-war opposition, when they reach out to people inside Russia, we see at least the results of this big counter-propaganda work, big information work, like those who were supporting the war, like unconditional supporting war in March of 2022, it was 53%. Now in June of 2023, it's 40%. It's less than we want. We want, of course, more people not to support this war, but at least we see some movements. Also, I don't know, maybe there are some regions with a more tradition of fighting for independence. Again, Chechnya is a good example. But even when Chechnya will break up, what exactly, what form will be there? Is it going to be Sharia, as many of these who are in opposition in exile are saying, or it's going to be a secular state? Or many like quote the Sakha Republic, but again, it's a good example. They probably can be sustainable. But the majority, like again, it can be divided into two parts. The industrial part in the south, it's like 80% are Russians. They probably won't want to break up. And again, saying about this, it's in every region. There are problems. There are so many obstacles. It's I don't know how to even overcome. But and also I don't see any. The last thing, it's very important.
Okay.
I don't see any blueprints of how to get there. I see a lot of policy papers, a lot of reform ideas, a lot of like Mikhail Khodorkovsky's team has been working on it for many years. My organization, many others. We have policy papers. We have a roadmap to reforms. We know how to democratize Russia. I haven't seen any blueprint of how to, like again, to have a separate regions.
Thank you, Natalia. And I'm glad there's a bit of dissent also among the panelists. I think it's really good to flesh out different opinions on how you see the future of Russia. So I do encourage any disagreement that you have with one another. I see we have a lot of questions from the audience also, so I'm going to start to weave them into my questions for the panelists, but I would just like to ask our panelists to keep your answers relatively short, because otherwise we're going to run out of time. So let's go back to Mikhail. Mikhail, I have a question here that if you will allow me, that I'll ask you from Thomas Harding from the National. He asked if you could perhaps comment briefly about the current arrest and purge of security personnel and frontline generals that we've seen over the last few weeks. And then if you can combine that with a question that I have for you, because we've been talking a lot now about Russian identity. Now, you've called for transforming Russia into a nation state, and you specifically want a political rather than an ethnic state, if I understand it correctly. And such a non-ethnic state, Russiskia Natsiya, will be based on the principles of citizenship rather than ethnicity. Can you explain what you propose and why? Thank you, Mikhail.
In terms of the generals and security leaders, I have not heard about many arrests or purges. There is no doubt, on the other hand, the events or the developments today show us two things. The first is that Prigozhin's position had a much deeper roots in the acting troops, not just the Wagner troops within the Russian armed forces had support as well. And secondly, Shoigu received an opportunity, thanks to this mutiny, to sort out his opponents within the Ministry of Defense or different ministries. I don't think that he got the powers to send them to prison directly, but he could make a lot of them resign, and he will try and do that. As for the nation state and the idea of the nation state, in order for people to want to live within the same state, they need to say to themselves that what unites us all is more important than the differences between us. What can unite us within one state? For instance, security issues. It could be transport corridors, connectivity. It could be culture, and this is perhaps the most major factor, the main factor, and language as well. First and foremost, is this more important than our differences? And the differences and the distinctions between us are the levels of social and political development, natural conditions, landscapes, distances to Asian and European neighbors and centers of civilization. And I must remark here, note that 80% of Russians live much closer, several-fold closer to the European centers of civilization rather than Asian centers of civilization. Only 20% of all Russians live closer to Asia, civilizational centers. And we must bear this in mind. This is the kind of geography we see in Russia. What is going to happen and what is going to prevail in real terms? I hope very much that if Putin doesn't stay in power for another many years to come, the first will prevail. What unites us is more important than our differences. This will prevail. That scenario would prevail.
I would also argue that a lot of it will depend on who comes after Putin, of course. Nelson Mandela in South Africa in 1994 did a stellar job of presenting South Africa as a rainbow nation, something beautiful with many different cultures and languages, you know, that people should embrace, you know, which was in stark contrast to the National Party, the vision that they laid out before that. Let's turn to Janusz again, and thank you for those words also, Mikhail. Janusz, now Putin has long cultivated his so-called power vertical, which you have argued is not sustainable. How do you think the Russian state needs to be reorganized? And I'll also throw in a quick question there from Ewan Grant, who's asking, you know, how do you see the role of Wagner operatives changing what their operations in Africa, if you're willing to answer that question? Thank you, Janusz.
Thanks. Yeah, I also wanted to respond very quickly to a couple of points Natalia made, but let me start with trying to answer your question. It also refers to what Mikhail was saying. 30 years since collapse of the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation hasn't been able to transform itself either into a nation state, as most of the former Union republics have, into a civic state, in other words, a democratic state, far from it, as everybody bears witness. A federation, it's certainly not a federation, as Natalia pointed out earlier on, as I talk about in my book, it's a fake federation, or even a stable imperial state. I mean, its attack on Ukraine shows that it has aspirations to be an empire, but even that is failing with the failing war. So I would say that the sort of Western hopes of democracy, international cooperation with this Russia actually turned out to be wishful thinking. And now, unfortunately, Ukraine is reaping, if you like, the negative rewards of Russia's reimperialization. which were ignored by too many people for too long. In terms of this power vertical that you talk about, yes, I think it's very brittle. I think it's much more brittle than the old communist structure. I mean, the Communist Party, if you remember, controlled most aspects of life. And in essence, there was some sort of a collective leadership that chose a successor. Sometimes there were conflicts at the very top, but they didn't result in major conflicts further down. I think Putin's regime is much more personalistic and therefore less secure. And I think much more susceptible to power struggles and attempts to dislodge him. And I think there will be different attempts to dislodge him by different actors that won't necessarily unite. Let me just refer to a couple of things Natalie said that I want to respond to. In 14 of the 22 so-called autonomous republics of Russia, the Ruski, the ethno-Russian population is actually below 50%. Not in all are the ethnic groups, the titular populations that the autonomous region is named after, but they are growing. The Russian population is declining. As Mikhail said, many Russians are leaving the region. I mean, large parts of Siberia, both north and south and east, are depopulating. The local population largely remains, and I think quite a few of the locals will be rediscovering their roots. A lot of it depends, of course, on what happens at the center in Moscow. And as Moscow, I think, weakens, is unable to provide the subsidies, is unable to extract all the resources as well because of preoccupation with war and the lack of manpower as Russian casualties continue to mount, and the squeeze of the sanctions, which I think are going to bite even further. And the depleting budget, something we haven't mentioned, maybe Mikhail knows more about this, but how the Russian budget is actually not only nosediving, but it's depleting a lot of the reserves that were accumulated during high oil prices. A lot of that is because of falling revenues, the loss of the European market. Another thing I would say is that Russians are not uniform. We tend to think of the even outside of the ethnic, the non-Russian ethnic populations, Russian identity is not necessarily uniform. And remember, it's worth remembering, Americans were English before they broke from Britain. So were Australians, so were Canadians. So, you know, independence does not necessarily mean that you have to be from a different ethnic group. The biggest fighters for Irish independence were English speakers. So language doesn't determine moves towards independence. It depends whether the state at the center can provide security, safety, and economy for local populations. If it cannot, then there are alternatives. And my very last point, sorry, my phone is ringing. Okay, my very last point is that, of course, not all the states that emerge from Russia will be democracies. Not all the states that emerged from the Soviet Union were democracies. Not even all the East European states that emerged from the Soviet bloc turned into model democracies. There's going to be a mix. It's going to be eclectic systems of states that do emerge from Russia. And I do believe it will be a rupture. Some of them will be more democratic, more Western leaning. Some of them will be democratic and Eastern leaning towards Japan. Actually, I'm going to be in Japan at the weekend next week, and we're going to be talking about this, what Japan can do to contribute to managing the instability that I think is going to be generated from Russia. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Janusz. And we're going to pounce a little bit more on the identity question because it's so much intertwined with Russia's future, as we've argued on this panel also. Natalia, how has the February 2022 escalation of the war shaped different Russian identities? And you've touched on some of those issues, but can you also tell us about the League of Free Nations and perhaps how it's perceived? Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. I don't know about, several Russian identities. Again, people in Moscow and Vladivostok, or I don't know, Novosibirsk and so on, they are they identify themselves as Russians, and they also identify themselves as Europeans. And if there are Siberians or Urals and so on, it's more geographical or cultural differences. Sometimes language-wise, there are some different names but overall, again, Russians identify themselves as Russians. Of course, with having so many ethnic minorities, I think, and again, with this issue of racism and everything else for so many years, and plus this disproportion of those who started to serve as a cannon fodder in this genocidal war in Ukraine, and again, simultaneously the ethnocide inside Russia was happening, of course, very disproportionate. It was immediately noticed by everybody, including by these communities as well. That's why many of them started to have their movements and organizations. We have never had such a diverse landscape of different ethnic minority groups. Free Buryatia was the first, then again, many followed, Free Yakutia, Free Kalmykia, Angry Chuvashia, New Tuva, and so on and so forth. Mostly they are anti-war organizations. They're trying to help their communities how to avoid going to the war, how to avoid mobilizations, how to get evacuated, how to terminate contracts, and like again, legal and human rights support to these people. So I would say it's an interesting landscape, but again, I wouldn't be confusing this more demand for self-determination, new identities, awareness, demand for justice, for with separatist movements. And Janusz correctly said that we haven't been able to build anything good on this territory yet. But I think with attacking Ukraine in such a brutal way, what Putin did last year, it was a suicidal mistake for this regime. I think it's clear for more and more people. Definitely clear globally, but inside Russia for more and more people that it just cannot be the same. And again, as you said, it's a personalistic regime. Anybody next will be probably weaker. And Putin himself is, again, being from mafia, being from KGB. He knows how to not to entrust too much authorities to this or that group. If some group has more political power, they have less resources or less law enforcement support and things like that. So it's still very possible to build democracy. It's a very difficult task. It's a task that is in our common interest for everybody. That's why everything that distracts us from this goal is not very helping. Friendly fires that we have to deal with since last year is very harming. Instead of, again, fighting with Putin and with propaganda of the Kremlin and everything else, we have to explain to our allies who we are for a long time, or and many other things. And I think this is one of the areas where self-determination is very important. It can happen only when there is democracy. We really need to have, we cannot win everything everywhere immediately. We have to set up priorities. We have to have good planning. Again, only democracy in Russia can bring again this opportunity for the region to self-determine. And this re-imperialism, I think, can happen when there is rupture, when any kind of breaking of, I don't know, 5 or 10 or whatever territories, then it will be anybody. Again, we were mentioning Yugoslavia, it will be Yugoslavia scenario. Anybody will be, again, Milosevic type populist leader will be very popular among people. And it won't be that if Russia is divided into parts, it will be safer for the world, because all this, they will be self-centered. They will be just dealing with their own business, trying to get this or that. No, we have a lot of evidence for history. Again, Yugoslavia is a great example. When there is such a, again, revanchism, re-indentarism, then it's also external expansions fueled by the popular support. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And I just want to remind our audience also that both Natalia and Kyle are on Putin's naughty list. I'm not sure about Janusz. If you're not on that list, you will probably soon be, Janusz.
I have been for a while.
You are, okay.
My book
right,
was attacked by Prigozhin a few weeks ago. So.
Very good, very good. So at least you know you've got the readership, and so that's great. But so all three of these individuals are, of course, intimately involved with you know, their work related to Russia. Mikhail, I don't know if you need to go, or can I ask you one more round of questions to all the panelists? And Natalia, I'm not sure if you have to go also, but I know Janusz is okay. Mikhail, are you okay with another question?
Yeah, конечно.
Excellent. Okay. So let me combine two questions that I have for you, and you can be very brief in terms of your response. But you spend a lot of time with opposition figures, and how organized or disorganized do you think the Russian opposition is in terms of to respond to either or to foment positive change in Russia? That's the first question. My second question is, if Russia experiences some form of a rupture scenario or some sort of disintegration, how will that impact China? And how do you think Beijing will respond? And I'm asking that specifically also because you mentioned China earlier, and it is such a big, I would hope, a big concern for China also, what happens in Russia. Thank you, Mikhail.
To begin with, we need to distinguish the Russian opposition, the Russian democratic opposition, and Russian human rights and anti-war movements. These are close entities, but they are not the same. Those people who are standing for supporting those people who have left Russia, solving their problems, for those who found themselves in a difficult situation, doesn't matter whether within Russia or outside Russia, helping them, aiding them, supporting them. Those people who support Ukraine by sending humanitarian aid, helping refugees, and at the same time, they don't plan to take any actions to take power in Russia. These are human rights, anti-war democratic forces, but they are not an opposition force. The opposition are those who want to take power in Russia. At the moment, it is clear, particularly after this mutiny, that taking power in Russia is going to be linked with violence, or at least with the threat of using violence. There is no other way. Of course, we could fantasize some peaceful solutions or resolutions, but it is most likely that this is not going to happen in a peaceful way. The part of the Russian democratic movements who are in opposition to the present regime are not unified totally yet, and therefore, yet there is coordination, ongoing coordination, even as part of our Russian Actions Committee, which represents all the opposition forces. And I'm talking about opposition forces, not those anti-war democratic forces. I'm talking about opposition forces who want to take power. So democratic opposition forces. And they interact and engage with each other quite effectively. How is China going to react to what is happening in Russia? Well, what China is planning is something I cannot tell you or even envisage. But based on my many years of dealing with China as a businessman, I can tell you that these are the people, this is a country that prefers to look at the world from within their own borders. They have had clashes with neighbors, but their preferences is not to expand. They want to gain economic advantages from their very tough foreign policy, foreign economic policy. So the weaker Russia becomes, the greater advantages for China for this imbalance in its engagement with the weaker Russia or the weaker regions of Russia. The probability or the possibility of China trying to control certain regions in China is very unlikely. It's not a high probability or possibility that China would want to control certain regions of Russia.
Thank you, Mikhail, and also for that nuance once again that you add to the discussion, especially reminding us that we have to distinguish between the opposition in Russia and then the democratic opposition, of course, which is a fundamental difference. Janusz, I'm going to circle back to you with a quick question. Also, you can be relatively brief. Given that you're there in the Beltway, I'd like to ask you kind of like a policy-based question. Now, with regards to Russia, do you sense that NATO member states are preparing for any possible rupture scenarios? And what do you think should NATO members be doing right now?
Yeah, thanks, Leon. I think there is greater realization. Also in Washington, I think there's greater realization that there are possibility that Russia is going to experience even more turmoil, even more instability, and that this war will come home to Russia itself. I mean, this Wagner mutiny, I think, sobered up a lot of people that we could be facing major crisis within Russia itself, for which we're unprepared. I don't think any planning has been done yet at this point, not in America. I know in some of the frontline states, of course, in Central Eastern Europe, they're looking at this much, much more closely. Also looking what's happening in Belarus very closely. We mustn't forget the Belarusian question, which is closely intertwined now, I would say, with the future of Russia. I think two parallel policies are absolutely needed. First, strengthening NATO members in case of any spillovers of conflict or provocations by Moscow to disguise the fact that it has its own internal problems. And also, I think, secondly, we need to be sending a clearer message to the citizens of Russia, and not simply Putin must go. I don't think that's enough, because as we see, the problem is not simply Putin. It's the ruling elite, it's the state structure. We need to talk about the system, not the personality. And I think the message to Russian citizens should be, we support pluralism, we support democratization, decentralization, genuine federalism, and ultimately the rights of all republics and regions to determine their future status. It's very clear. I mean, there is nothing wrong with that. This is should be part anyway of the Biden democracy building agenda. Unfortunately, for some reason, it hasn't focused as much on Russia as it should. Maybe because we fear provoking Putin, provoking the regime. We see where fear of provocation has led Ukraine. So anyway, I think messages need to be sent, positive messages to the Russian citizens of all nationalities, that change is possible, but you cannot simply sit on the sidelines as the crisis deepens in your country. Otherwise, you're going to face more repression, more economic decline, more foreign wars, and your neighbors are going to look at you with even more disgust. I mean, you go to Ukraine and ask them what they think now of Russians. It's unfortunate, but this is, the relationships are going to be ruined for generations. And of course, most of your young people are going to want to leave as well. Is that the kind of future you want? It's about time you begin to stand up, speak up, and demand your rights, express your grievances, because this state is on its last legs.
Thank you, Janusz. I couldn't agree more. I think without a concrete message from the West, we fail to also engage moderates in Russia, which means that the general public pivots towards the hardliners, which is a great risk as you've laid out. Also, Natalia, final words from you. I want to ask. One of the things that really interests me is that there are some dividing lines among Russian opposition parties, as well as within civil society, with regards to how this war will end and the future of Russia Would you mind just saying a word or two about that to close us off? Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you, Leon. Well, I'm very glad that Mikhail Khodorkovsky defined this term opposition. I never liked it. I never was always advising to our pro-democracy politicians not to say it. Opposition, like it's like somebody who criticizes without any constructive alternative. And words like pro-democracy movement are much more appropriate, pro-democracy forces. And I would say that the main dividing lines between Russian pro-democracy movement and civil society are drawn by propaganda and censorship. And again, on the main, we could have different names of different organizations, different movements, but our main unifying thing is that we are anti-war and pro-democracy, and right now it's already enough. We already are doing so much, and it's great that we started to coordinate more in our efforts to become more efficient. And on the main issues of like the vision for Russia, that it should be a democracy, that it should have democratic institutions and rule of law and everything else, again, we are all on the same page. And on the question of Ukraine, again, all these legitimate borders of 91 and like territorial integrity of Ukraine and independence and any support, any retributions and everything else, it's also on the same page. I think on the issue of federalism and democratization, we are also on the same page. So I would say that there are much more unifying lines rather than dividing lines. But it's great that, again, Mikhail identified who is opposition, who is ready for this violent takeover of power. And again, all the rest of the community who are human rights, those who are working daily, concretely helping Ukraine. Like again, my organization only, we still, even with the name Free Russia, still Russia, but having an office, to have an office in Kiev, and this year, until this year, it's quite an achievement. Or conduct a press conference in Kiev in June of 2022, it's quite an achievement. We do work in doing everything to support Ukraine with, again, advocating for sanctions, for more assistance, military and humanitarian, we are working on search of Ukrainian POWs and civilian hostages in Russia, and many, many other things. And I think the more we do, the less dividing lines there will be, because again, words can divide a lot. Canceling all Russian was just a very bad thing, helping Putin and the Kremlin's propaganda much more. And what we were advocating all this time, saying that don't judge us on the basis of our ethnicity or citizenship. Please judge us on the basis of our values and our actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And thank you also for all the very valuable work that you and your organizations doing at present. I know that it's not easy to be, in civil society at present, and the cost of your work has also significantly increased. A lot of your fellow civil society members who are anti-war have since left also Russia, and so that means you're working out of multiple offices around the world, which adds further complications to your work. I think that brings us to the end of our discussion today. I'm really sorry we didn't have more time, because it feels like we need a few hours on unpacking just some of these issues. But I would really like to thank all three of our panelists for their valuable perspectives. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, thank you so much for joining us. Janusz Bugajski, thank you for joining us. Natalia Arno, again, thank you for joining us. To our audience, we'll take a short summer break before we will be back with the Russia-Ukraine dialogues in the near future. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.